Have you ever wondered what it costs to change the course of a nation? Most of us are taught that history is shaped by politicians, by generals, and by those who wear the crowns of industry. But if you look closely at the bedrock of human progress, you rarely find someone who started at the top. You find someone who started in the dirt. You find someone who was once considered nothing more than property, a tradable commodity in a world that didn't believe they had a soul. This is the story of a man whose life began with a transaction. George Washington Carver was born into the brutal reality of the American Civil War in a place called Diamond, Missouri. While he was still an infant, a gang of Confederate night raiders stormed his home. They kidnapped his mother and the infant George, tearing them away from the life they knew. His mother vanished into the dark, lost to the history books, never to be heard from again. George, however, was recovered, not by a hero on a white horse, but through a grim negotiation. His former enslaver, Moses Carver, traded a prized racehorse to get the baby back. That was the opening act of his life, a child valued less than a stallion. Imagine the psychological weight of that. To grow up knowing your own origin story is rooted in a financial exchange. Most people would have allowed that trauma to define them. Most would have grown up with a heart hardened by resentment, looking for a way to climb out of the mud by any means necessary. But George was different. He didn't want to leave the soil, he wanted to understand it. Even as a small, frail child, George was not interested in the games the other children played. He was fascinated by the woods. He was fascinated by the way a wilting plant seemed to whisper its needs to the air. He began to heal the plants in his small garden, earning him the nickname, the plant doctor. People thought it was a quirk, a strange hobby for a boy who had every reason to be bitter. They didn't realize that George was listening to a language that everyone else had forgotten. He was learning that the earth doesn't care about your social status, your race, or how much you were bought for. The earth only responds to care, to patience, and to the quiet, persistent work of the gardener. As he moved into his teenage years, the hunger for knowledge became his primary fuel. It wasn't a hunger for money. There was no guarantee of wealth for a black man in the late 1800s. It was a hunger to know the why behind the how. He walked miles upon miles, moving from town to town, working as a cook, a janitor, or a farmhand just to afford a book or a school fee. He was turned away from countless schools, not because he lacked the intellect, but because of the color of his skin. But every door that slammed in his face only served to deepen his commitment to the soil. He realized that the South was trapped in a death spiral. Cotton was king, but King Cotton was a tyrant. Year after year, it demanded the same nutrients from the ground, until the soil was exhausted, barren, and gray. The people who farmed it were just as exhausted as the land. Sharecroppers were locked in a cycle of debt, unable to grow anything but the crop that was killing the soil, and unable to eat anything but the meager rations they could afford. He saw the suffering. He saw the empty tables and the tired faces of people who had been told that their value was tethered to a dying crop. And here is where the seed of his journey began to sprout. He didn't see himself as a victim of the system. He saw himself as a scientist with a mission to heal. He didn't just want to teach them how to farm better. He wanted to teach them how to live without the chains of economic dependency. He knew, even back then, that the transformation of a nation wouldn't happen in the halls of government. It would happen on the small, tired patches of ground owned by people who had been forgotten. He was preparing himself for the silence of the laboratory, for the decades of ridicule, and for the life of radical, unassuming service that lay ahead. He was learning that if you want to save a nation, you don't start by changing the laws. You start by changing the harvest. There is a profound, almost agonizing beauty in the middle of a great journey. For George Washington Carver, the middle wasn't a hero's parade. It was a decade of intense, invisible work at the Tuskegee Institute. He arrived in Alabama in 1896 to lead the agriculture department. What he found was not a laboratory, it was a literal shed. He had no equipment, no budget, and very little support. But he had his own grit, and he had a vision that was far larger than the shacks he worked in. The world wanted to know why he didn't leave. He was brilliant. He could have gone north. He could have sought fame. He could have pursued the riches that his scientific discoveries promised. But George stayed. He stayed because he knew that the people who needed him most weren't in the universities. They were in the fields, struggling to feed their children. This was his currency of scars. Every day in the lab was a battle against disbelief. Farmers were stubborn. Why should they listen to a man who wanted them to plant something other than cotton? Cotton was the only way they knew how to get cash. Asking them to plant peanuts or sweet potatoes felt like a gamble with their survival. Carver didn't respond to their doubt with arguments or papers. He responded with the work. He traveled the countryside in a makeshift laboratory on wheels, which he called the Jessup wagon. He brought the science to the people. He stood in the mud with them, showing them that their soil was tired, just as they were. He taught them about nitrogen-fixing plants, the legumes that would breathe life back into the dirt. He was teaching them the secret of restoration. To get something back, you have to give something back. It was during these years that he unlocked the potential of the peanut. The world at the time saw the peanut as a lowly animal feed, a peasant crop. Carver saw a miracle. He took the humble peanut and, through relentless experimentation, derived over 300 products from it. Plastics, fuels, dyes, medicines, cooking oils, cosmetics. He unlocked an entire industry from a shell. But it wasn't about the products. That's the part most people get wrong. When you hear about Carver's 300 inventions, you think of a man obsessed with science. But he was obsessed with people. He created those 300 uses for the peanut so that there would be a market for the farmers to sell their surplus. He was creating an economy where there had only been a dead end. He was essentially telling the farmers, if you heal the soil will provide for you. And if the soil provides for you, I will make sure the world values what you grow. He faced immense pressure to monetize his findings. The major corporations of the day saw the potential for billions in profits. They came to him with contracts, with offers of high-paying roles, with the keys to a life of luxury. George Washington Carver turned them all down. He refused to patent his discoveries. He gave them away to the public for free. Imagine the audacity of that. To have the power to become one of the wealthiest men in America and choosing instead to keep your modest room at Tuskegee. He once said, "It is not the style of clothes one wears, neither the kind of automobile one drives, nor the amount of money one has in the bank that counts. These mean nothing. It is simply service that measures success." This was his silence of the soil. He worked while the world wondered why he wasn't succeeding. He was being mocked by those who didn't understand that he had already achieved something greater than fame. He was building an irrigation system for a drought-stricken people. He knew that if he kept the knowledge to himself, it would die with him. But if he gave it away, it would grow roots in thousands of families. The struggle wasn't just physical. It was the emotional toll of carrying the weight of a people on his back. He was often lonely. He was often misunderstood, even by his peers. But he kept going. He understood that the greatness of a seed is not in the shell, but in its willingness to be broken apart so that it can become a forest. His scars were the times he was turned away, the times he was ridiculed, and the decades he spent working for almost nothing. But he realized that these scars weren't marks of weakness. They were the currency he used to pay for the future of his people. The end of George Washington Carver's life was not a tragedy. It was the completion of a long, beautiful harvest. By the time he passed away in 1943, he had fundamentally changed the American South. The cotton monoculture was broken, the soil had been rejuvenated, and thousands of families had found a path out of abject poverty. He had saved an economy, but more importantly, he had saved the dignity of those who worked the land. When he died, he left behind nearly everything he had saved, over $33,000, to establish a foundation for the continuation of agricultural research. He had entered the world with nothing. He had been traded as a piece of property, and he had departed having given the world more than it could ever fully calculate. But the harvest of George Washington Carver wasn't just the 300 uses for the peanut. The harvest was the mindset. He taught a generation of people who had been told they were less than, that they were capable of scientific mastery. He taught them that the land they worked on was not an enemy to be conquered, but a partner to be respected. Think about the contrast. On one side, you have the world of success, the world that values fame, profit, and ego. It is a world that builds golden orchards with shallow roots, orchards that wither the moment the winds of hardship blow. On the other side, you have the world of Carver, the world of deep roots, service, and patience. It is a world that builds slowly, in the silence, but produces a harvest that feeds nations. When you look at your own life, what are you cultivating? Are you chasing the fast crop, the one that looks good for a season but leaves the soil barren? Or are you willing to do the hard, invisible work of healing the ground? We are all carrying a seed of potential. It might be a dream, a business idea, a piece of art, or just the desire to become a better version of yourself. But most of us are too afraid to plant it because we want the harvest today. We want the fruit without the season of waiting. We want the success without the currency of scars. George Washington Carver's life is a standing challenge to all of us. He reminds us that the harvest isn't the destination. The harvest is the person you become while you are waiting for the growth. He shows us that when you stop trying to win and start trying to serve, you tap into a source of power that no corporation or market can ever touch. He didn't just feed a nation, he fed a soul. He showed us that even if you start as someone else's property, you can end as a master of your own destiny, not by dominating others, but by understanding the earth beneath your feet. As we look at his legacy, we realize that the seed shop is everywhere. Every morning, you walk into a room, a kitchen, an office, a field, and you have the choice. You can stay in the fog, looking at the orchard of others, feeling bitter about what you don't have. Or you can get down in the mud, get the dirt under your fingernails, and start the long, slow work of building something real. Things don't get buried just to be hidden, my friend. They get buried so they can rise. You are the guardian of your own harvest. You are the architect of your own growth. And if you are willing to pay the price, if you are willing to give away your ego, your excuses, and your need for immediate applause, you will find that your life can bear fruit long after you are gone. George Washington Carver is gone, but the roots he planted in the American soil are still holding firm. The river he created is still running. The question isn't whether you can change your nation or your world. The question is, are you willing to plant the seed, endure the storm, and wait for the harvest? Your time in the silence is not a waste. It is the foundation. Keep working. Keep planting. And remember that the hardest part of the journey is not the giving up. It's the waiting. But the harvest? The harvest is worth every single scar. Stay tuned. Keep growing. And never let the world convince you that you are anything less than a force of nature. Your harvest is coming. You just have to be willing to do the work in the dark.